See, in the chapter before, Kit and Moon made their shelter. It's a 2-story. On the top, they got a deck that they can like lay out and hang out in the sun. But then they also can use that to kind of cover them, and it's pretty small inside, so their body heat keeps them warm. And even if it was too cold, they dug a pit, put some hot rocks inside of it, covered it with some marsh grass to keep them warm through the night, which is actually pretty good thinking, if you ask me. So, chapter 26, life is going pretty well for Kit and Moon. The warm stones beneath us and the thick walls of the shelter kept us warm that night as the icy front settled over the forest. When morning came, we lay on our backs between the blankets well after daylight, not wanting to face the cold. Man, I hope Hal made it, Kit said. He made it if he followed the creek. What if he had to spend the night out there? Ooh, I didn't think of that. Well, he had his jacket and those dogs to huddle up with. Kit was quiet with his thoughts. Bet he likes those dogs now, he finally said. We laughed at Kit's joke. When do we have to get out from under here? He said. I lifted the edge of the blanket and exhaled into the air. My breath clouded out before me. I let the blanket back down over my face. We'll let the sun warm things up for a little while. Good, said Kit. I guess it to be about 8 o'clock when we crawled outside. It was just below freezing and the leaves were brittle and icy under my feet. We pulled the blankets out of the shelter and draped them over our shoulders for warmth. I gave Kit the extra one, but he still shivered, and I knew that, as thin as he was, the cold probably passed right through him. Maybe we should make those deerskins now, or deerskin clothes now, he said. I was determined to make sure that Kit didn't get uncomfortable and leave like Hal did. You stay here, I said. I'll go hunting and get us a deer. Kit nodded and started gathering wood to rekindle the fire. I'm just curious, is it that easy to just walk out at 8 in the morning and go find a deer to kill?
No.
No, I mean, it takes quite a long time. I mean, you went deer hunting last weekend, right? And you saw 2 doe?
Yeah, and I hunted straight for 2 days.
Yeah, hunted straight for 2 days and came across maybe a couple.
I killed a 7-point
Nice.
with a muzzleloader.
It wasn't long before the sun warmed the forest into the low 40s. I moved silently along the top of a ridge where I hoped to spot a deer feeding near a wide creek below. Even though I knew I'd be able to find game, I was worried about my weapon. Pap and I had made plenty of spears and bows and arrows, but only for practicing in case there was ever a time when we wouldn't be able to get bullets. We had killed squirrels and rabbits with our homemade weapons, but never something as large as a deer. I wasn't sure that my hickory stick and shoelaces would shoot an arrow with enough force. After I crept across a ridge for close to 20 minutes, I spotted a doe. I angled downhill, stopping whenever she lifted her head and looked about. I slipped quietly through the trees until I was about 20 yards from her. She didn't detect me because there was no breeze, and the ground leaves were moist and silent from the melting frost. I placed a tree between myself and the doe so that I had cover while I prepared my bow and arrow. Once I had the knock of the cattail shaft fitted in my taut shoelace string, I craned my head around the tree. The doe fed with her head down again. It seemed that the entire forest had become quiet, watching me and the deer. I lifted the bow. I pulled back the arrow, and I leveled it on the doe's neck. When I released, the bow thwonged noisily, and the doe leaped into the air as the arrow caught her just above the shoulder. She crashed through the gallberry thicket at a full run. I felt myself shaking uncontrollably. Papa told me about buck fever, but I had never had it until then. I found her about 100 yards down the ridge by following her blood trail. The arrow was broken off near the skin where she fell on it, and a faint trickle of blood came from the wound. Her glazed eyes told me that she was dead. Just to make certain, I nudged her with my foot. She didn't move. Even after I field dressed the deer, she felt over 100 pounds. What's field dress mean?
Meant you skin them in a field.
Pretty much. Pull their guts out, skin them. Yeah. Gut them. You ever had to do that before?
Yes.
I've gutted like 7 or 8 deer.
That's messy.
It's pretty fun. I had to eat a raw piece of meat.
Some venison?
What?
Some raw deer meat?
Yeah,
like
Daddy said if I didn't do it, I wouldn't go and I ate that stuff.
You were going to go hunting again if you didn't eat it?
Yeah.
Probably some of the best meat you could find. Even after I field dressed the deer, she felt over 100 pounds, and I knew I wouldn't be able to get her back to camp alone. Taking a long piece of wisteria vine, I strung her up in a tree. I made sure the head swung a few feet from the ground because I didn't want coyotes to get my kill before I returned with Kit. When I told Kit I'd killed the deer, he leaped up from shelling acorns and followed me to the ridge. We skinned and butchered the doe on the spot until all that was left was the carcass hanging from a tree. I explained that we'd return when the ants and sun had cleaned the bones, and we make tools from them. At the bottom of this hill is a big creek, I told Kit. We'll call it Deer Creek. It'll be a good swimming place when we get some warm days. We pulled the rest of the deer on one of the blankets. Back at the shelter, the first thing I did was make 2 drying racks. On one, we placed the stomach, intestines, bladder, and sinew. What's sinew? Do you know? Go ahead.
Sinew is the stuff that the deer's been eating.
It's not stuff they've been
Yes, it
eating.
is. Yes, it
That
is.
they've been eating?
Yeah, it's something that's in their gullets. Yes, it is. I know. It's where their sinew is where the deer where he eats and it digests. It digests.
So it's in and around the intestines, and it's inside the deer, but it's like the ligaments and stuff that hold all that stuff together. And when you dry that out, then you can use that as a string, like for a bowstring and that kind of
I
stuff.
would do this. I was cutting my deer this year. I actually hit that stuff. Oh my God.
Because that's so digested food in there. All right, let's keep going. Let's keep going. Let's see. The first 3 items could be cleaned and used for food storage, while the sinew could be pounded and separated for thread, fishing line, traps, and bowstrings. On the second rack, I put the venison that I had planned to build a fire under and smoke. To save the pieces of the deer that we weren't going to smoke, I made a storage pit and a small shelter under a pine tree. I showed Kit how to line the inside of the pit with hot rocks so the moisture was steamed out of the dirt. Leaving the rocks in place, we then lined the pit floor walls with a thick layer of dried grass. Into the pit, we placed the deer's eyeballs, which we could use for paint and make glue. We also saved the brain to treat the hide and the hooves to crush and boil to make waterproofing oil. I covered the pit with cedar bark and to keep away insects and worms. To disguise my scent, I put on another layer of strong-smelling pine needles. To disguise the scent, I put on another layer of strong-smelling pine needles. Finally, I laid a slab of limestone over the top to protect it against pawing animals. What little was left of the deer, I wrapped in a scrap of hide and hung from a branch to use as trap bait. The cold front, talk about processing the whole deer, like they're using everything. Eyeballs for glue, brains to tan the hide.
Yeah, because they don't want to go out of the woods. They want to stay in the woods.
They're living off the woods. And Native Americans used to do that stuff for centuries, years. The cold front moved out and the weather became warm enough so that some of the days we didn't even need our jackets. Over the next week, we worked on scraping and drying the deer hide and smoking our jerky strips over hickory coals. Oh, some deer jerky over hickory coals. Getting hungry just thinking about it.
Deer steak.
It was pleasant work under clear skies, surrounded by the smells of hickory smoke and curing meat. We would work for a while, then have a meal of venison jerky and whatever vegetation we had prepared for the day. With our stomachs full and our faces and hands streaked with soot and animal fat, we'd lie back and nap under the rustling leaves. Sometimes we went for hours without talking, only smiling at each other and keeping our hands busy with shelling acorns and trimming jerky and rubbing the hide with the deer and brains. Kit began to learn how things were done, and I had to show him less and less. One morning we heard a plane, and we ducked into a shelter and watched it as it passed overhead. It was the small single-engine kind like Pap and I sometimes seen flying over our shelter. Hey, you think it's looking for us? I don't know, I said. We heard it pass by 2 more times that day, and then we didn't hear it again. The next day, I told Kit I was going to check on the hanging deer carcass to make sure that the squirrels weren't eating the bones. I made my way back to the ridge, moving silently, watching for signs of game. When I came within 100 yards of the place, I heard someone shout, "Hey!" I froze and held my breath. My eyes darted about, and I took notice of all the patterns that the branches and leaves made so that I could tell if anything was out of place. I knew that voice was Sanders, and it set my heart to pound it in my chest. I wasn't going to move until I was sure that no one was watching me. I heard Sanders' voice again from across the ridge, although I couldn't make out the words. He seemed to be cursing loudly to himself. I slipped through the trees, careful to always have a large trunk between myself and the direction of Sanders' voice. After a while, I saw movement in the place where we left the carcass. By lying on my stomach, I was able to wiggle close enough to watch. Sanders had cut the carcass from the tree, and he was pacing around it in circles. His uniform was torn on the jacket sleeves. The front of his shirt and pants were soaked with sweat. His hair had pieces of straw and leaves clinging to it. The dirt was smeared over his face and his hands. Son of a... he said while shaking his head. He kicked the bones and finally flung the carcass off into the bushes, losing his balance and then stumbling after it. I realized he too was being very alert. So I stood back. I realized he too was tired and to be very alert, so I stood and backed away out of sight again. Then I turned around and I ran to the top of the ridge where I could watch him with little chance of being discovered. Sanders sat near the carcass. After a while, he got up again. He staggered down the ridge toward Deer Creek. He'd not gone far when he stopped and he leaned against a tree. He rested for a moment before yelling out over the valley, "Hey! Did anybody hear me?" He was quiet for a few seconds, as if he was listening for something. And then he kicked the ground and hung his head. I watched him for what seemed like 5 minutes before I wondered if he had fallen asleep. I began to get up slowly, keeping an eye out for him the whole time. Just as I straightened my legs, I saw him pitch forward and scream, "Ah!" as he went tumbling down the hill. I spun around and I ran back for the shelter. So what happened to Sanders?
He went tumbling down the hill.
Yeah, he goes tumbling down the hill, but when was the last time they saw Sanders?
When he took the dogs after him.
Yeah, when they took the dogs after him, which it sounds like it's probably been at least a few days. So what's that mean for Sanders? His shirt and jackets are all torn up. He's covered in dirt and sweat. He's got leaves in his hair.
He got lost in the forest.
Is it a good chance that Sanders got lost out in the middle of the woods? Okay, so Sanders lost out in the middle of the woods, nobody else around, and Moon just happened to run into him. Kit was collecting firewood when I got back to the campsite. He watched me wide-eyed as I caught my breath. "Oh, Sanders," I said, he's out there. Where?" I pointed back at the ridge. Not far from where we left the deer. "Did he see you?" I shook my head. "No. Man, he's mad and tired and yelling for somebody to find him. Last I saw him, he was falling down the ridge." "You think he's been out all night?" "Yeah, I think he got lost. If he finds us, man, he's so mad, there's no telling what he's going to do to us." Kit's hands fidgeted at his sides. He sat down on the log across from me. "Policemen can't hurt you. Pap says the government can do whatever they want to you if they get set on it. Sanders is a crazy constable. There's no telling what he can do. You got any ideas?" "Yeah," I said. "What?" "We'll whip up on him." "Moon," I stood up. "We're going to whip up on him good." "No, Moon. Come on, I need your help."